Wall Street declared a new Mexican moment. JP Morgan said it. Morgan Stanley said it. Mexico became America's #1 trading partner. Record foreign direct investment, $36.8 billion in 2024. The peso was soaring. The narrative was irresistible. But here's what they buried in the footnotes. Of that record FDI, only 8.6% was actually new money. The rest, 91.4%, was just companies already in Mexico reinvesting their own profits. The boom you're hearing about? It's an accounting illusion. And the poster child for this entire bet, a $10 billion factory that was supposed to change everything, hasn't laid a single brick. We'll get to that. So if the foundation is already cracking, what are American companies really betting on? And what happens when the house of cards comes down? Picture this. You check your 401k on a Tuesday morning. It's down 12%. Not because of a tech crash or a banking crisis, because a water shortage in Monterrey shut down 3 auto plants that supply GM and Ford. That's not hypothetical. It almost happened in 2022. This isn't just about one country's economy. It's about a $505 billion trade relationship, the largest bilateral trading partnership in the Western Hemisphere. Mexico exports 82% of everything it makes to the United States. That means every time you buy a car, a medical device, or an avocado, you're touching this bet. The companies in your 401k, GM, Ford, Medtronic, Honeywell, they're all in. If nearshoring fails, you don't just get higher prices. You get supply chain chaos, factory closures on both sides of the border, and an economic crisis that makes 2009 look like a warm-up. In 2009, Mexico's GDP contracted 6.6% because the US sneezed. What happens when the whole house of cards collapses? To understand how we got here, you have to understand the original promise of Mexico, a promise made decades ago that created a system now reaching its breaking point. There's a woman in Ciudad Juarez, let's call her Maria, who has spent 20 years assembling the same automotive component on the same production line. She earns less in real terms today than when NAFTA was signed. She is not an outlier. She is the Maquiladora system. The Maquiladora system began in 1964 under Mexico's border industrialization program. The deal was simple. Import components duty-free, assemble with cheap labor, export. No technology transfer required. No local content mandates. No joint venture obligations. 100% foreign ownership allowed. NAFTA in 1994 was supposed to change everything. It didn't. A Dallas Fed study concluded, and I'm quoting here, "The results are resoundingly negative. NAFTA did not make maquiladoras grow faster." The Carnegie Endowment found that real wages for most Mexicans today are lower than when NAFTA took effect. And a GAO report documented that a network of domestic Mexican suppliers for the maquiladoras largely failed to materialize. So what did 60 years of this model produce? Today, approximately 5,000 to 6,000 factories operate under IMEX, the maquiladora successor, employing nearly 3 million workers and accounting for over 80% of all manufacturing exports. Yet Mexican small and medium enterprises largely lack the technical sophistication to serve as Tier 1 or Tier 2 suppliers for advanced manufacturing. When companies leave, they take everything: knowledge, IP, equipment, supply chain relationships. Mexico retains only the building and the displaced workers. Think of it like a hotel. Mexico provides the room. Foreign companies bring the furniture, the staff, the minibar, the guests, and the revenue. When they check out, Mexico is left with an empty room and a cleaning bill. Now you might be thinking, okay, that's the past. Surely this time is different. Let me show you why it isn't. While Mexico was assembling, China was building. And 3 numbers tell the whole story. Number 1. Shenzhen. In 1980, it was a fishing village with a GDP of 270 million yuan. By 2023, 3.46 trillion yuan. That's a 12,800 times increase. China's special economic zones contributed 22% of GDP, 45% of national FDI, and 60% of exports. Mexico's attempt at SEZs? President Peña Nieto created 7 special economic zones between 2016 and 2017. President AMLO cancelled all 7 in November 2019. His reasoning? They were supposed to help, but they never did anything. Shenzhen is now 44 years old. Mexico couldn't sustain its SEZs for 2. Number 2. Infrastructure spending. China spent roughly 9% of GDP on infrastructure through the 1990s and 2000s. Mexico invested 0.2% of GDP in 2020. Not 2%, 0.2%, the lowest in the OECD. Number 3, and this is the one that should terrify anyone betting on the nearshoring thesis. The share of Chinese value-added inputs in Mexican exports has actually increased since 2015. Mexico isn't replacing China. It's increasingly assembling Chinese components and slapping a Made in Mexico label on them for tariff avoidance. Let that sink in. For years, this system chugged along. But now, as America tries to pivot from China, the fundamental flaws of the Mexican model are being exposed. And the first illusion to shatter is the idea that money is actually flooding in. You heard the headline in the opening. 91% of that record FDI was recycled money. Now let me show you the trajectory. In 2022, 48% of FDI was genuinely new money from new companies. 2023, 13%. 2024, 8.6%. First half of 2025, 7.4%. And the number of new investment announcements, according to Deloitte, dropped 75% in the first 8 months of 2024 compared to 2023. Wall Street wrote the narrative. Capital didn't follow. So why are new companies so hesitant? Because they're seeing what the headlines ignore, a country where the cost of doing business is measured in blood, blackouts, and bribes. The first cost that never appears in any consultant's PowerPoint is the cartel tax. An AmCham Mexico 2024 survey found 45% of member companies received extortion demands, direct protection payments known as cobro de Peso. 12% reported organized crime has taken partial control of their sales, distribution, or pricing. And according to INEGI's National Victimization Survey, 97% of extortion goes unreported to police. Think about that for a second. 97% unreported. And when it is reported, only 0.8% of all crimes in Mexico reach a positive resolution. Do the math. If you're a foreign executive sitting in a boardroom in Detroit deciding where to build your next factory, those are not encouraging numbers. The scale is staggering. 27% of Mexico's 1.3 million registered businesses were victims of crime in 2023. Coparmex, the Employers Association, estimates extortion cost businesses roughly $1.3 billion that year alone. But that's just the direct cost. 58% of AmCham firms invest 2 to 10% of their entire annual budgets purely on security. The total economic impact of violence in 2024 reached roughly $245 billion, equivalent to 18% of GDP. 18%. That's not a line item, that's a second economy running in the shadows. The watershed moment came when FEMSA, parent of the ubiquitous OXXO convenience store chain, the largest in Latin America, closed all 191 stores in Nuevo Laredo after the Northeast Cartel abducted employees and forced them to act as lookouts. Then the head of the Business Chambers Federation in Tamaulipas, A man named Julio Almanza was assassinated after publicly denouncing cartel extortion. The message was clear: speak up and you die. Cargo theft is endemic. Approximately 36 trucks are hijacked daily, with over 62,000 hijackings between 2015 and mid-2022. 75% occur on just 10 highways in Guanajuato, Puebla, Querétaro, and Jalisco. The journalist Ioan Grillo coined the term narco-inflation, where cartel extortion costs are passed directly to consumers, contributing to rising prices in both Mexico and the United States. Hey, quick question for the comments. If you ran a company and 45% of your peers were being extorted, would you still invest? Or would you take your money somewhere else? Let me know below. So let's recap what we're selling here. Beautiful weather, proximity to the largest consumer market on Earth, only 36 trucks hijacked per day, and if you're lucky, the cartel will only take partial control of your distribution, not all of it. Sounds like a bargain. But wait, there's more. The second cost is the infrastructure that doesn't exist. And here's the twist that makes this even more painful. Mexico actually ranked #1 globally for infrastructure procurement efficiency in InfraCompass 2020. The problem isn't how Mexico builds, it's that it barely builds at all. Ports. Mexico's entire container port throughput, 8.3 million TEUs in 2023. China's, 268.9 million, 32 times larger. Mexico has only one deep-water port capable of receiving post-Panamax vessels, Lázaro Cárdenas. China operates 7 of the world's 10 busiest ports. Rail. Mexico's total rail network, 28,864 kilometers. China's, 162,000, including 42,000 kilometers of high-speed rail built from essentially zero since 2004. Mexico has zero high-speed rail. Electricity. This is where it gets brutal. 91% of industrial parks have reported power supply failures. Mexico's electricity cost, roughly 18 cents per kilowatt hour, double the US and China. Morgan Stanley estimates Mexico needs $40 billion in incremental energy spending for nearshoring over the next 5 years. Instead, public investment contracted 26% in 2025. And in May 2024, a single blackout struck 21 of 32 Mexican states. Water. In summer 2022, Monterrey, Mexico's industrial capital, population 5 million plus, the site chosen for Tesla's Gigafactory, ran out of water. The Cerro Prieto Dam dropped below 1% capacity. Nationally, over 35 million Mexicans lack sufficient water access. 30 to 70% of clean water is lost to leaks in aging infrastructure. And natural gas. Mexico has only 2.4 days of storage. The United States, 107 days. 74% of Mexico's natural gas supply comes from US imports. 54% of total electricity is generated with that imported gas. When Winter Storm Uri hit in February 2021, it caused massive blackouts across northern Mexico. A preview of what happens when this single-point dependency fails. This combination of crime and crumbling infrastructure is a deterrent. But the most seductive part of the Mexico story, its super peso, is hiding the most dangerous vulnerability of all. The peso isn't strong because of nearshoring. It's strong because of two things. High interest rates creating a massive carry trade, Banxico at 7% versus the Fed at roughly 4.25%, and a hidden subsidy. $64.7 billion in remittances in 2024. 96.6% from the United States. That's 3.7% of GDP, more than oil exports or tourism. The peso is a leveraged play on American economic health, not a reflection of Mexican fundamentals. And those remittances, they fell 4.6% in 2025, the biggest decline since 2009. This reliance creates a feedback loop, a trap that makes Mexico dangerously dependent on the one thing it can't control: the health of the American economy. The Maquiladora system and the informal economy are two sides of the same coin. Mexico's labor market is structurally broken. The focus on cheap labor created a permanent state of low-skill, high-turnover employment. Annual turnover reaches 25% for mid-sized companies and 31% for large companies. In border cities like Tijuana and Ciudad Juarez, rates are even higher. Companies are constantly training new workers, erasing the wage savings. Now, here's something most people completely miss. The average hourly manufacturing wage in Mexico, $4.90. China, $6.50. Vietnam, roughly $2.50 to $3. India, $1.50 to $2. Mexico isn't even the cheapest option anymore. It's competing on geography alone. And remember what I said earlier about assembling Chinese components? That share of Chinese value-added inputs in Mexican exports has actually increased since 2015. Mexico isn't replacing China, it's becoming China's final assembly station for tariff avoidance. But beneath the formal Maquiladora economy sits an even deeper problem. 54 to 55% of Mexico's employed population, roughly 32.8 million workers, work informally. No contracts, no benefits, no tax contributions, no training records. 23% of Mexico's GDP is produced by the informal economy. You can't build the next manufacturing superpower when half your workforce is invisible. No tax base for infrastructure, no social safety net, and a permanent underclass that fuels instability and crime. Now connect the dots. This is where it gets truly dangerous. Watch what happens. The US economy slows. American jobs are lost, especially in construction and hospitality where migrants work. Job losses mean remittances to Mexico fall, already down 4.6% in 2025. Falling remittances mean the peso weakens. Its main support is kicked out. A weak peso means Mexican inflation spikes because imports become expensive. Inflation means social instability worsens and cartel power expands in the chaos. Meanwhile, 82% of Mexico's exports go to the US. When US demand drops, factories stall. Stalled factories mean job losses in Mexico. More people flee to the US. Immigration crackdown. Remittances fall further. This is not a theoretical model. We saw this exact sequence play out in 2009. Mexico's GDP contracted 6.6%, the worst in Latin America. Trade fell 43% in 6 months, and that was before the cartel economy reached its current scale. Now, if this were the first time, you might give Mexico the benefit of the doubt. One bad cycle, one unlucky recession, it happens, but this is the 4th time. And the pattern is almost identical every single time. The Mexican miracle, 1940s through the 1970s. 6% GDP growth for 3 decades straight. Ended with the 1982 debt crisis, bank nationalization, peso collapse, hyperinflation. NAFTA optimism, early 1990s. Mexico hailed as a model emerging market. Over $45 billion in mutual fund inflows. The result? The 1994 peso crisis. Currency collapsed from 3.4 to 7.2 per dollar. GDP fell 6.2%. Inflation hit 52%. It required a $50 billion US bailout. The Aztec Tiger, 2012 to 2015. Thomas Friedman, writing in the New York Times, called Mexico a rising power to rival India and China. Comprehensive reforms passed. The result? GDP growth slowed to roughly 1%. 43 students disappeared in Ayotzinapa. Corruption scandals across the government. And now, the nearshoring hype. 2022 to present. Once-in-a-generation opportunity. A $277 billion pipeline of announced projects. Mexico becomes #1 US trade partner. The status today? GDP growth of 0.5% in 2025. A judicial reform scaring investors. And the USMCA review looming in July 2026. Former US Ambassador Antonio Garza identified the missing element in every single cycle. His words, anything related to seriously strengthening rule of law. 4 moments, 4 collapses, the same missing ingredient every time. All these traps, security, infrastructure, labor, and dependency, are converging right now, and the poster child for the entire nearshoring dream has already given us a terrifying preview of the climax. The Tesla Gigafactory in Nuevo León is the single most instructive case study of everything we've talked about. Here's the timeline. February 2023. AMLO announces Tesla in Santa Catarina, Nuevo León. March 2023. Musk confirms at Investor Day. Described as a roughly $10 billion investment, $15 billion including suppliers. July 2023. Governor Samuel Garcia says permits are nearly ready. October 2023. Tesla confirms slowing plans. Musk tells investors, "We want to get a sense for what the global economy is like." July 2024. Musk officially pauses the project. His words, "It doesn't make sense to invest a lot in Mexico." November 2024. Economy Minister Ebrard seeks a meeting with Musk. His response to reporters? He hasn't told us anything. Early 2026. No construction has begun. Tesla shifted all plans to robo-taxi production at Gigafactory, Texas. The project appears effectively dead. Nuevo León had invested $153 million in infrastructure incentives that produced nothing. Roads, water treatment, highway expansion. And the cascading damage? Steel, aluminium, and parts suppliers tied to Tesla's supply chain, according to the SWP Berlin think tank, called into question. Other suppliers likewise stepped on the brakes. Remember the open loop from the beginning. A $10 billion factory that hasn't laid a single brick. Now you know the story. But it's not just Tesla. The institutional infrastructure is crumbling too. The September 2024 judicial reform, direct popular election of all roughly 7,000 judges, triggered a nationwide judiciary strike of 55,000 workers, diplomatic crises, and Morgan Stanley downgraded Mexico to underweight. Moody's warned the reform would be particularly harmful to future investment in nearshoring. Foreign firms reportedly held back roughly $35 billion in investment projects. Mexico's Transparency International score dropped to 26 out of 100, its lowest ever. 140th of 180 countries. The worst evaluated OECD member. Over 60 politicians were assassinated while campaigning in 2024. The World Justice Project Rule of Law Index ranks Mexico 121st of 143 countries. Its criminal justice score, 0.25 out of 135th globally. When even the judges are elected by the same population that cartels intimidate, who exactly is going to enforce the contracts that nearshoring depends on? This isn't a prediction of a definite future, but a warning of a probable one. So what happens now? And who are the real winners and losers? There is a version of this story where Mexico makes slow, painful progress. A few sectors with deep existing clusters keep grinding forward. Automotive, 3.98 million vehicles produced in 2024, with EV production up 30 times since 2020. Aerospace, $11.8 billion annually, over 380 companies. Querétaro ranked 4th globally for aerospace FDI. Medical devices, 8th largest manufacturer in the world, over $12.5 billion in exports. The companies succeeding in Mexico share one profile. They arrived years or decades ago, built deep operational knowledge, invested in security and relationships, and operate in established clusters. Foxconn, over 30,000 employees across 7 campuses. BMW in San Luis Potosi, 500,000th vehicle rolled off the line in October 2025, with an additional €800 million investment committed for their Neue Klasse EV platform. These are the survivors, not the newcomers. But the broad transformation, it never happens. Partial success, not a revolution. Then there's the darker version. A US recession coincides with the USMCA renegotiation crisis in July 2026. Remittances dry up. The peso tumbles. Cartels expand their power in the chaos. The supply chains America bet its future on are paralyzed. Mexico's GDP crashes like 2009, or worse. President Sheinbaum's Plan Mexico targets positioning Mexico among the top 10 economies worldwide, increasing investment to 28% of GDP by 2030, and creating 1.5 million specialized manufacturing jobs. The plan committed 5.6 trillion pesos, roughly $323 billion, in public investment. But the structural trajectory runs the other way. She reversed the 2013 energy opening, reclassified Pemex and CFE as public state enterprises, and dissolved independent energy regulators. Pemex sits on roughly $101 billion in total obligations. Crude output has dropped 26% since 2018. The government allocated $137 billion to the Pemex rescue between 2019 and 2025, and debt declined by only $20 billion. Subsidies, pensions, and debt servicing now consume 44% of total spending. And the USMCA review begins July 1, 2026. Commerce Secretary Lutnick doesn't expect to review, he expects to renegotiate. Here is the harsh reality. No country has come close to replacing China. China's manufacturing output, roughly $4.6 trillion in 2022. Vietnam's entire GDP, $430 billion. India's Make in India campaign targeted 25% manufacturing as a share of GDP by 2022. 10 years later, it actually fell, from 16.7% to roughly 13 to 15%. McKinsey's Joan Jai and Nick Leung published a book titled "The Next China is Still China." They're probably right. The nearshoring thesis is not a fantasy, but it is dramatically mispriced by Wall Street. The companies succeeding in Mexico arrived years or decades ago. The next China narrative, which implies wholesale manufacturing shift, ignores that China spent trillions of dollars and 30 years building its ecosystem. The most telling statistic, and this brings us full circle, of all the record FDI flowing into Mexico, 84.4% in the first half of 2025 was just existing companies reinvesting their own profits. The new money, the nearshoring money, has largely stayed on the sidelines. Wall Street wrote the narrative. Capital didn't follow. And if you haven't seen our deep dive into Taiwan's Silicon Shield, how one island manufactures 92% of the world's most advanced chips, and why losing it could crash the global economy overnight, check it out. Links on screen. Now I want to hear from you. Drop your prediction in the comments. Slow bleed or snap.